All right, we are officially live. Welcome everyone to another fireside chat with the Black Girl Doctor. This is part 2 of our 3-part series entitled The Real Story of the Strong Black Woman. Thank you for participating in the polls. And again, I'm going to leave this up for a second so we can keep looking at this, but by the looks of it, we have a lot to talk about today. Let me see. Oh yeah, everyone can see the responses. Great. Yes. So we have a lot to talk about today. So again, welcome. Today's discussion is entitled Moving Beyond Working Twice as Hard. I am Dr. Taisha Caldwell-Harvey. I go by Dr. Tai, and I'm a licensed psychologist and the founder of the Black Girl Doctor. The Black Girl Doctor is a virtual therapy practice that specializes in supporting the unique needs of professional Black women at the individual level and in the workplace. And I am joined today by 2 psychologists from our team, Dr. Jacquelyn Johnson, who goes by Dr. J, and Dr. Domonique Shaw, who goes by Dr. Dom. And I would like to ask each of you to just say hello and introduce yourselves. Dr. Dom, if we could start with you.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. It's such an honor to be a part of this space and a part of this conversation. Like Dr. Tai said, I am Dr. Dom, and I am a licensed psychologist. I am really passionate about working with underserved populations and specialize in grief and loss, anxiety, depression, aging, and more recently, I've been really delving into clinical work around the imposter syndrome.
Thank you and welcome. If all in the chat, if you could say hey to Dr. Dom.
Hey.
Hey y'all, I'm Dr. J. So great to be with you again. Piggybacking off of what my colleagues have shared, super excited to be here to have this discussion. I care deeply about exploring and addressing the narratives that often hold Black women to really impossible standards, right? So if you were a part of our last talk where we talked about the strong Black woman and here today, working twice as hard, that's really what I'm about, and how we kind of give all to everyone else and we tend to come last, and to the detriment and to the neglect of our own well-being. And so that's what I care about, is helping us live free, whole, and complete lives. And so happy to be here and to chat with you all here today.
Thank you so much. And I don't know about you, but I am ready to get into the topic for today. For those of you who are watching today, please be encouraged to utilize the chat feature to talk to each other and to talk to us throughout the session. We want to make sure we can feel your energy. And I also want to make sure that you are speaking to everybody and not just us. So if you are with us today, if you can go ahead and just make a comment in the chat, say, hey, tell us where you're from or something, so we can double check, make sure you got your settings together and we can see you and we can see your comments. We want to make sure that we stay interactive with you. Thank you. We see you. Bianca, you are talking just to the host and panelists. If you could change your settings to everyone, that would be great. Then everyone can see your comments. All right, Keisha, Ryan, Dorianne, Kimberly, we got you. Charmaine, perfect. Ooh, we got folks from Toronto, Bay Area, San Diego, Boston. Okay, folks from everywhere. Yes, yes. Okay, we in there. Yes, Bianca, you're in there. All right, Jan from Minneapolis. Great. Okay, so lastly, if you have a specific question today that you want us to answer, please drop it in the Q&A feature, which will make it the easiest. That'll be the easiest way for us to find it every time we pause for questions. So chat, we're going to be watching it. Talk to us in the chat. If there's a specific question you want to make sure that we answer when we pause, put it in the Q&A function. Okay, I'm going to close the polls and I'm going to share those results with everybody so everybody could see that. Looks like we've got 75% of us that have received the work twice as hard message. Looks like about half of us are currently operating under that, a little more than half of us. And then let's see, work output. Yeah, so about 69% of us, feels like our productivity is a significant part of our identity. And have you ever considered not working twice as hard? It looks like everyone's like, I consider it all the time. Maybe follow-up question is, what are we doing with that? And then last question, do you regularly engage in intentional rest without guilt? It looks like about half of us can do that, which actually is amazing. And from what I think we normally see. So thank you for participating in those. Without further ado, I'd like to get right into the topic. As many of you may be aware, most little Black children are taught that you'll have to work twice as hard to be considered half as good in this country. In our conversation today, we want to talk more about that messaging, take a close look at how it can end up tied into toxic productivity, and talk through real strategies for potentially shifting away from that concept. And so to get us started, I want to talk a bit about how this message ends up getting delivered to us. I remember getting this message a lot from both of my parents, but two instances that stick out are one, when I was in middle school and I started struggling with math. I was excellent in school pretty much up until that time. And then I had a teacher who was a math teacher who was blatantly very mean to me, to the point where my dad had to come up to the school and talk to him. He had to talk to him, and he talked to the principal. And turns out there had been several complaints about that teacher and his treatment of Black students. And I was usually one of the only or very few Black students in my classes at that point. And after that interaction with my dad, he was less mean to me, but he pretty much just ignored me mostly after that. And it was confusing for me and hurtful. And I really started disliking math and disengaging at that point. And I remember that. And then I also remember that next summer, my dad enrolled me in a summer math program, and I was pissed, right? In a year, not liking math. Then he put me in summer math camp. And I remember telling him, like, this wasn't fair. Why do I have to spend the summer in math at this college? This really sucks. And he reminded me that I was Black and I wasn't going to fall behind because of racist teachers. And I was going to have to work twice as hard as everybody else to make sure that that didn't happen. And I had no choice, but I went to math camp, right? Another significant recollection actually has more to do with socioeconomic status than with being Black. And I remember my first year at Spelman College, which, if you aren't aware, is a historically Black women's college. And within the first week of being in college, I realized quickly how subpar my education had been compared to the range of experiences of my peers, who came from a wide range of socioeconomic statuses and backgrounds. And I actually remember talking to my mom after my first week of classes while contemplating if I'm going to be able to hack it at this school. And in that conversation, basically, I concluded that if I wanted to stay, then I was going to have to work twice as hard. I was going to read twice as many books and try to catch up to everybody else. And I spent my first year not getting super involved in extracurricular because I was trying to catch up academically. So I want to just ask that same question to our panelists, our guests today. And if you could both share a little bit about either the first time or the most significant time you can remember being told that you have to work twice as hard to be considered half as good in this country. What do you recall about that growing up? And if Dr. Dom, we could start with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Ty, for sharing that. It overlaps a little bit with my experience, but also at the same time, I was a little bit anxious of feeling like an outlier, because I don't really remember getting the message growing up and as a young person. And part of that is because I have terrible memory, and I probably did and just don't remember. But clearly it wasn't salient enough for it to stick even into adulthood. But some of the factors that I think played into why I didn't get that very strong, salient message was that my mom was a single parent of 4 kids. And so I often observed her almost being in this like survival mode and fighting to just keep a roof over our head, food on the table, in this sense that working twice as hard was not even a priority. It was like, okay, like what can you do to get through today? And so I didn't get the message from a very like loving, caring space. And instead I got it from life. And I remember it first hitting me that I was going to need to work twice as hard when I got into grad school. And so I went to grad school at the University of Iowa. So middle of nowhere, Iowa, corn town. So very isolated in terms of seeing people who look like me in my classroom, as you know, the staff and faculty. And I think that played a big role in this mentality that I took on. A lot of my early experiences were simply being the only Black person in the room of, you know, my 10 cohort classmates, that I was the only Black person, and seeing how stark the comparison was from that educational standpoint. You know, some of my colleagues went to Big Ten colleges or, you know, Ivy League colleges. And so it just was very clear that this space didn't feel like it was for me. And I had to fight to stay. I remember telling myself, like, I am going to finish unless they kick me out. And I have planted my feet in that reality, and I didn't get kicked out. So that's good. I'm here, licensed, working, and all that good stuff. But one very salient memory that I have was during our kind of educational process, we get ready to apply for internship, which is like our launching pad into our professional world. And my academic advisor, or just advisor in general, also was the lead person over preparing us for internship. And I remember us sitting down for a one-on-one and talking through all the sites that I was planning to apply to, and telling her my goal is to get into the VA Palo Alto. And for most of you don't know anything about that, but VA Palo Alto is probably like one of the top tier, especially VA training sites. And so I was already feeling anxious about this goal, but the response I received from her was, you know what, Domonique, getting or being matched with VA Palo Alto would be like you getting accepted into Harvard. And again, not a message from a very loving space, although she was my ride or die up to that point. And so it was really conflicting. I didn't even know how to feel in that moment, but I knew that the message was, if I was ever going to meet my goal, reach my dream of coming back to California after 5 years of living in Iowa, that I was going to have to work twice as hard. And so that's what I did. I went in that grind mode. I started, you know, really focusing on my essays, all the materials that went into the application process, and got matched for my goal.
Come on, honey. Yes.
And then not only did that, but then, you know, spent the year, and then that was a whole nother exposure to this idea of working twice as hard, because again, I was actually then one of 2 Black women, but still just like looking at the room and not feeling like there was a seat for me, forced me to then work twice as hard to then get matched for postdoc at VA Palo Alto. And then as soon as I finished my postdoc, getting offered a full-time position as an early career psychologist. And so it reinforced that working twice as hard gets me where I want to be. Whether that's half as far or as far as I want to be is another question, but it reinforced that this mentality works. Which is both good and bad.
So good. That's a whole word, Dr. Dom. I'm like, oh, okay, I'm excited because I'm excited to continue the conversation. And it's so interesting. It's so much overlap in our stories to some degree. And so when I kind of think about my first experience with this messaging, middle school, it's the same as you, Dr. Ty. And so I'm born and raised in South Central Los Angeles, and so that's my hood. That's where I'm from. And so for middle school, though, I was bused to the Valley. So my parents enrolled me in this program to get, quote unquote, better education, which is a whole nother issue with busing, another conversation. But that was my first time in a really diverse setting, right? So up until that point, it was predominantly Black and Latino kids in my school. And so because I was labeled like smart and gifted, I was placed in advanced classes where typically one of a few Black kids in the classroom. And I distinctly remember my dad at the time telling me that I'm going to have to work twice as hard to prove myself because I already had 2 strikes against me. I was Black and then I was a girl. And that this is before, intersectionality, what? Like this is 10 or 11 years old. But, my dad really, I think wanted to not have me live in this la la land and kind of like, no, this is real world now, which is insane that you kind of have to even get the messaging as a kid that, okay, this is the real world. And so, I knew I had to work my butt off to not be either relegated to the background or kind of overlooked because I think people would dismiss me just because like, oh, okay, well, this Black girl's here. Like we can't expect much from her or she's not going to contribute much. And so it was the first time that I had this consciousness that the world wasn't rooting for me. And that was kind of a really rude awakening for me at that point.
Yeah, such a strong, powerful thing to think about a child receiving that message, right? The world's not rooting for you. Like, wait, what? Especially when you're raised by a loving family that is pouring into you. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, no, but that's just here. Everywhere else.
They're not for you.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate both of you sharing those stories. And I think like the stories in and of themselves are simply just our truth. And I've personally seen a lot of good come from that messaging. And it takes circumstances where we'd otherwise be very confused. And I think it makes sense out of crazy making, right? It explains what is happening when we're being gaslit. And it gives us a roadmap to fiercely go after whatever it is that we want and to not be held back, I think, by systems of oppression. So what happens is you end up taking on a persona that nobody in power wants to give you anything, right? And your way around that, though, is to just be so good that they don't have a choice. And I think once that really sinks in, I think it makes us genuinely different, right? Like you start approaching life very differently. And I hear that in both of your stories and even in the way I think about and have thought about myself. And I really am constantly amazed by the excellence I see in Black women. And I'm wondering if that is one of the threads, right? That we have internalized some messaging that, I can get there and I'll just be so good that nobody has a choice but to let me in the room, right? And in our clinical practice at the Black Girl Doctor, we work with incredibly talented and accomplished women who have worked themselves into rooms and to seats at all sorts of tables. But this doesn't come without a cost, right? So we're talking about, this is the way it's been. This is the way I've gotten where I want to be. But Dr. J, when you think about the professional women that you work with who are mid-career and beyond, what have you seen in your clinical work as the toll that Black women are paying for carrying this narrative with them since they were children?
Yeah. All of that. I mean, it is like every session that I have constantly amazed by like, what? You came from where and where are you now? It's amazing. And I think there is this kind of really deep down belief, like we can do anything, like we can take over the world. And we will prove it to you kind of one step at a time. And so even, kind of within one generation, seeing how women have completely changed the trajectory of their lives, right? In terms of professional success and financial independence and wealth and freedom, and that is so amazing. And of course, there's always kind of an other side to this too, right? And so what I find is that it doesn't come without a significant cost to their emotional wellness primarily. And so I think many of us have accepted without question the narrative that if we don't sacrifice, right, our entire selves to be the quote unquote best, and however you define best, that can be different for each and every one of us, then we will either for sure not maintain our positions or we will definitely not advance. And so the pressure is that we have to work twice as hard all of the time. And the kicker here is that it's never enough, right? So even if, with the clients I work at who've attained the top levels of, leadership and who are at the places that they want, they still feel like I can't rest. I can't just be here. I have to continue to work twice as hard to keep my position. And so that leads to a lot of hyper performing. And so consistently going above and beyond, right? Not just for a project here or there, but like everything, 110% effort and ability, which is really unsustainable. And so there's this feeling that I can't say no, that I can't set boundaries, all in the name of, as Dr. Tai, you said earlier, productivity, right? Which can lead to kind of toxic productivity. And it's toxic because we are not allowed to be human. And, we are demanded to be superhuman, which ironically actually strips us of our humanity with this demand to be superhuman all the time. And so there are very real consequences to kind of this twice as hard mentality.
Yes, it's so what you're saying, it's like this, it doesn't stop. So it's like we commit to a way of being, and we're gonna do it all the way.
We hear y'all. Yes.
Committed, right? To our detriment potentially. And given what Dr. J shared, controversial question, Dr. Dom. So are we saying Big Mama was wrong? Are we saying our parents are wrong? Are we saying, all our elders have led us astray, right? Or, they sent us down this path, and, and now there's some toxicity that is showing up. How do we make sense of the fact that there's sage advice to work twice as hard can and sometimes leads us to an inability to lead full lives, and it can cripple our foundation, in a way that we are placing our value on our output?
No, this is a very heavy question because nobody wants to go against Big Mama.
Say that again. Yes.
Don't get in trouble.
I'm not going to go against her. I do honestly feel that she was onto something. I really tried to take a step back when I think about just the mindset that went into whoever was the first to verbalize this out loud, and think about the context of the time and experiences and all the many factors that led to the belief that we needed to work twice as hard. And just do some perspective taking, because sure, it may not have led to the kind of outcome that they were thinking of when it all started, but that at its origin, it made a lot of sense and probably was very adaptive and protective on some level. And when I think about it, it rings true of this sense of like macro level survival. I talked about my mom and her being very in this survival mode, and that maybe was more like just individual and like small micro level focus, whereas this thought and this mentality is more like collective and macro. But I do wonder and doubt that Big Mama had any sense of the consequences and what the long-term effects of working twice as hard was going to be. Really that in the short term, the thought maybe being that it would help to move the needle or open up doors for ourselves, but also future generations. But I don't think it was ever clear that it could, like Dr. J was highlighting, lead to all of these negative impacts. And it really forces us to take a step back and do a different kind of perspective taking, where we can evaluate for ourselves, like how to interpret the message. Again, that like context, whenever this originated, was X, and now context now is Y, and what is that Y? And how can we make sense of it for ourselves? Because like any thought or belief system, that they function and they work for a season. You know, that maybe there is a season for grinding it out and working twice as hard, but maybe there's a season where we do need to rest. But we get so habitual about our ways of operating to the point where we don't critically think about these things and ask ourselves, you know, what do I need? And what kinds of ways of thinking about the world and myself are going to help me move there? And so I really think we got to like step back and look at that, you know, very simple, basic pros and cons list of like, okay, how is this serving me? Or how is it not? How is it working for me? How is it not? And when we recognize that in some areas, in some ways that it's not serving us, how we can pull back and either, you know, modify it on some level, change it and make it our own, or completely let it go and move forward in something new and different. And really finding a little bit of a combination of both, like that macro collective form of survival and resistance and resilience versus more of the micro level. And the micro level I see as being more opportunities for us to rest and to be preserving and protective of ourselves that doesn't involve this hyper focus on productivity and work.
That's interesting. I hear you almost saying like there's this maybe overarching macro level of, yes, I'm going to grind, I'm going to work hard, but on the day-to-day, that doesn't look like doing that specific task every day, right? That looks like there are days when I do this or seasons where I do this, but I also rest. I also do I do other things. Yeah. Very interesting. I would add, I think that the advice coming down to work twice as hard was good advice. And that I don't think that many of us would be where we are without it. I don't think I would have accomplished the things I have accomplished without it. And I would agree with you that I see the problem as us failing to realize when we've made it, and that the strategy of doing that will only take you so far, and not being able to identify the point where we have to pivot, but we just get stuck there. Right. And then I think there's a lot of distress when I think about, you know, even the clients that I see, you know, folks coming in with burnout, they're like grinding in the same way, and they've reached the point where it's actually not propelling them anymore. But you know, it's worked, and then you get to this point where you're doing it, and there's no out. You're not getting the outcome that you were getting before. I heard TD Jakes speak on a podcast once, and he shared this story about perception of success. And he talked about how externally, pretty much throughout most of his career, people saw him as successful. I don't think anybody would look at him and think, oh, he's not successful. Everyone's like, yes, that man is successful, right? But he talked about from his perspective, that success has looked like lots of ups and downs. It's looked like him almost losing his business a few times, and there's been traumas and trials and all of these things. And he has felt very head down and constantly in the mindset that I'm trying to make it, I'm trying to get successful. And he said that, you know, it wasn't until he was 50 that he realized that magical place he was imagining of like made it, that it didn't exist, and he was already living in it, right? He said he was already successful, right? And he was missing it. And that was so powerful to me in thinking, and I see that reflected in, you know, in Black women, is that we are constantly trying to be successful and we're missing it. Like, you need to know when you are successful, right? And just thinking about, you know, we're working twice as hard to get someplace, but like, where is the place, right? And who has ever recognized when they got to the place where they made it? And so when I think this is kind of a good place to pivot to say, like, where do we go from here then, right? Like, so if working twice as hard, you know, can get us someplace, right? And there's something we can pull from that and put it into context. What should be happening when we are positioned to move beyond that mentality? right? And let's start maybe by identifying the critical point. And so, Dr. J, if I can ask you to chime in on just how are we supposed to know when we've made it, right? Like, what are some of the signs that we have established ourselves enough that we can stop working twice as hard and maybe shift into something else?
I mean, these questions, Dr. Ty, is giving me life, and like hard, because I think even in thinking about that, it makes me stop and reflect on my own life. And you're right, it's kind of like we are so grinding so hard for decades that it's kind of like, yeah, when do you make it? And so to start off, I really want to caution us to not base whether or not we've made it upon other people first and foremost, right? So whether they acknowledge us or praise us or validate us, because that's always a moving target. And I think in some ways we give away our power when we make someone else the arbiter of acceptance, right? So if I'm accepted, if I've made it based on some external factor of what someone else thinks, you're setting yourself up for failure and you will never feel like you've made it in that sense. And so kind of with that, my suggestion would be to first think about what making it looks like for you, because I think it's different for all of us. Like how do we define success and how does that compare with your present reality? And I think the kicker is what we've been sharing about so far is that so many of us are so busy grinding and working that we don't even pause to see, wait, have I attained what I've been working really hard for all these years? And so we don't really have that space to reflect. And so kind of looking at what is in alignment with my life, and what are the gaps? Like, what do I have left to maybe achieve and go after? And so, some examples of that may be, do you have a track record of wins and successes in your job? Or are you at or close to the income level that you want to be at? Or are the people asking you for your advice? Have you become, kind of like the expert on your team and in your field? Do you feel like you're utilizing the full scope of your talents and expertise? Are you engaging in work or projects that are important or meaningful to you? Are you no longer the newest person on the team, right? And so it's kind of, I think sometimes we're acting like we're the perpetual newest person that has something to prove on a team. And so taking a step away to kind of evaluate it, and Dr. Dom talked about this before, like evaluating where you're at and seeing, does this line up to your definition of success? And then here's the hard part, and here's where I get the pushback sometimes from my clients in my one-on-one. It's like, okay, we say you have made it. Okay, then is it time to scale back, like Dr. Ty was talking about? Like, how do we know, okay, maybe this is not a season of grind, maybe this is a season of rest? And here's where I think it's most difficult for many of us is now we have to start acting like we've made it, right? And transitioning from that, I'm in like new grind hustle mode. Like, no, I've made it. So now that has to look different than grind hustle mode. And so even sometimes I'm challenging, what would it look like to show up at 80% or 90% of your effort instead of 110%. And most of the people were like, no, I absolutely cannot do that. And it's always interesting because they'll say, I'm going to get fired. Like, that's the first response I get. Like, if I give 80%, I'm going to get fired. And I'm like, sis, there is no basis for that. And so, but I think that's kind of the hard part is actually living out of that and having clearly defined boundaries and being more selective about who and what has access to your time.
Yes.
Because then it becomes a rabbit hole. Because like, okay, I lose my job, then I lose my house,
right?
Or like it's a never ending like spiraling down when
yes.
that hurts.
I'm saying, yeah.
The stories, right, of clients who are telling us, I'll be fired and homeless. That is the bottom line. And you walk it through specifically, like you are so far away from that ever happening and when you're looking at the facts. But I think most of us jump to that because that is where we've been operating from. And sometimes we need to challenge those beliefs, right? And say, is what I feel actually true?
Good, yes.
So once we've identified we're there, so let's assume that we're going to listen to our therapist. We're going to trust that maybe we actually made it and we can work at 80%. And you like, Mama, I made it. what do we replace that with, right? So I think one of the things that's important is that you don't just get rid of a belief and then just operating from nothing, but that we replace beliefs that are no longer serving us, right? So if we're taking the belief, I have to work twice as hard, or I'm gonna get fired if I work at 80%, and we're gonna replace it with something else. What would you suggest? And I would love for both of you to weigh in on this. Dr. Dom, if we could start with you, and then Dr. J, please jump right in.
Yeah, so for me, I think there are two shifts that can happen. So one being shifting from a mentality of like doing and pushing forward to being and slowing down and being still. And so for me, what I see is that the thought of like working twice as hard, getting you half as far, it reinforces, like Dr. J and all of us have been talking of this hustle grind mentality, or the doing, like being hyper focused on doing. And so when we can like shift out of that a little bit and simply be, that we allow ourselves to get free from these things that keep us stuck and that aren't serving us. And so when we're in this doing movement and pushing forward and having that like future oriented perspective, we, like Dr. J was saying, we don't recognize ourselves, and we don't recognize our success, and we tend to fall into the imposter cycle where we minimize our strengths and our talents, and we begin to feel like we're a fraud and that we don't deserve the success that we're having. And that just leads to all these internal self-questions and doubt about our worth. And so by shifting to being, it allows us time and space to really lean into our greatness and to shift more from like perfection to being good enough. But even in the good enough, recognizing that our good enough is probably pretty great. And so we need to lean into that. And almost to Dr. J's point of like checking the receipts and really running it back and doing some accounting around like, what were our wins this week? What were the things that we did well? But being in that doing mode doesn't allow us to do that. And so we really have to shift to just simply being and being confident in who we are and what we and how we are showing up in the world. And so allowing ourselves some of that space. And then the other shift I would say is, you know, the saying is we have to work twice as hard. And so shifting away from I have to I get to. And so when we shift to I get to, it offers more choice, and staying stuck in I have to really represents this like bondage and being tied to something. And so if we can shift out of that and get more into the get to, that's where we select what we're working on. Again, to Dr. J's point of like, okay, what is the work? What is the goal? What are we doing and why, really? And so you get to select and you get to protect your time and space in a way in which you can see the different responsibilities and day-to-day tasks as things that are depleting on one end and enriching on the other, and be able to choose the more enriching activities to be the things that you pour your energy and time into. And so, for example, for myself, I don't mind working twice as hard for my self-care, for my daughter, for my marriage. And so that doesn't feel like work to me. But in order for me to get there, like I have to shift towards I get to be a good mom. I get to be a good enough wife, and not hyper focus on whether or not I am, you know, making X amount of money or whatever these other goals are that aren't always centered around what truly matters to me. And so, yeah, just really taking that time to slow down and clarify what it is that we're working on and what we get to have the opportunities to work on.
That's such a just such an important shift in like mindset and right and approach and perspective. And so I am so on board with what you said about separating work from identity. I think for a lot of us, especially as Black women, work has become our identity, and kind of seeing that work is just one facet of who you are, and there's so much more to you than just your work self, and knowing, I think, that you are inherently valuable and worthy simply because you exist and have breath, right? And so work, if you don't perform another task, if you don't earn another award, if you don't receive another accolade, you are enough. And that's your base level, that's your starting point, right? And I think divesting from the lie that you have to consistently work to prove yourself, because I think that's behind the narrative of I have to work twice as hard to, and this like what's not said is to prove myself or to prove that I belong or this, that I, I should be here. And so I would just kind of challenge all of us to kind of think about, what did you work this hard to attain, right? So you work twice as hard to what end? To for what higher purpose. And so what good is having all the accomplishments and the money that you want if you can't enjoy your life? And so people are making the most money that they've ever made in their lives and having these positions of power, and yet their lives are like not fulfilling and they're not enjoying their lives. And I'm like, well, what is all of this for? And so transitioning from a mindset of I'm living to work to viewing work as a tool and as a means to provide for the kind of life that you want to be living, for both you and your loved ones. And so, because no one at the end of their lives looks back and say, I wish I would have spent more time at a meeting, or I wish I would have missed another family event to give more, to do one more project. It's always about, the things that really matter are community, family, and the things that give you joy. And if your life is not about that, to some extent, I'm not saying that it's that completely right. I know you have to work, and for many of us, to pay the bills, but is there some level and some room for bringing some joy back into your life?
Yeah, I think it's so important to understand your motivations, right, behind what it is that you're doing. And I will, I will just share just from a psychological perspective, our behavior, the way we move is directly linked to what we believe about ourselves and the world, right? Mm-hmm. So if I believe I have to work twice as hard to get to my next step, then my behaviors are going to match that. So I'm going to bust my ass to try to get there, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And I'm going to work twice as hard. But if my truth is that I had to work twice as hard to get where I am, and to get to my next step, I have to take risk and I have to stand in my power. That belief is going to motivate different behaviors, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not going to necessarily work twice as hard, but maybe it's going to push me to be more visible as a thought leader, right? Like maybe it's going to push me to do executive coaching, right? Or maybe it's going to push me to apply to a new position or start my own business or whatever it is. But when what I believe to be true about myself and the world matches up with reality, that's when we see doors opening up. That's when we see us able to kind of move in alignment with our purpose and we feel fulfilled. Somebody asked a question, I want to pull it in, a direct question that says, for those of us who've tried to scale back from 150% to 110% and then been criticized by our bosses, it's really hard to think about that, right? Mm-hmm. And I agree. And I think though, if your mindset, your belief is that you have earned your respect in your industry, you should be able to stand in your power for your next step. Your behavior might be different than if you feel like you have to work twice as hard to move ahead. So if I believe that what I need to do is, I have something to offer, right? And I have established myself, it might push me to get another job versus continue to work 150% when I'm not doing that no more. Right. And so it isn't that the environment won't push back, but it is that you want to be able to make moves that are in alignment with what your reality really is. For some of us might not be there, right? It might be that, oh yeah, I need to establish myself a little bit more. But for those that, really have, like, have you even checked? Right. I think that's kind of the point, is that you got to actually take pause and take time to stop and ask yourself, like, am I in a place where I can do this?
Right. I would say too, like, yeah, sorry to cut you off, Dr. Ty, but a pushback is, like you said, to be expected, because it seems like you set a boundary there when you scaled back, and no one likes to have a boundary because they don't have access to you fully as in the ways that they had before, right? And so by you setting a boundary to protect your peace, your time, your wellness, people are going to be upset because it's like, I want all of you when I want you. And so kind of having to say, okay, yes, you do, but I'm not required to give you access to me. And so I'm willing to deal with that you may criticize me or not like me, but it's for the greater purpose of, protecting my wellness. And then kind of, figuring like Dr. Ty was saying, what choices do you want to make from there? Like if it's consistently a toxic, hostile work environment, maybe I don't need to be here because they can't respect the fact that I need to protect my peace. And so, but that's a great question, and a great point that you will inevitably get pushback when you show up differently.
Yeah. And it's also this question of like, where are you seeking that confirmation from of like this being the right choice? Because so often we look to the outside world and like you're saying, Dr. J and Dr. Ty, like you're just not going to get that from your boss. And so you do have to go deep within and really make sure that the choice is aligning with you and what you want to move into and confirm for yourself. And so it's hard because it can feel isolating when you're trying to do this work, you're trying to live a healthy lifestyle and all these things, and you're not getting that validation and support. But like when you lay down at the end of the day, do you feel good about these choices you're making? And that's the bigger question.
Yeah, it just made me think of something in that a lot of this work that, when we're doing it with clients ends up in some major shifts in the way that we're moving and being. We see a lot of clients in our work changing jobs, starting their own companies, shifting, making big moves, but that are very much in alignment with like, oh, like, yeah, I know something, and I should be respected for the things that I'm doing, and finding spaces where they can do that work. So this is very challenging work, but very rewarding work as well. And I want to shift us to wrap this up a little bit, even though I feel like there are 30,000 more questions to be asked here. But I want to ask each of you if you could share your best advice for living in that balance of working hard and standing in your power. And I think that's what we're talking about, right? It is working hard and then not forgetting to check in and being able to actually stand in what you've built for yourself, in your competence. So wherever you are right now in your journey, Dr. J, if you could get real specific about like, what is some advice for how do you live in that balance?
Yeah, super, super hard. Not an expert. I'm in the trenches with y'all. Just want to put that out there. But I think for me, affirmations are really huge. So like Dr. Ty talked about before, creating new narratives, right? To give me a little bit more flexibility that I don't always have to show up working twice as hard. And then also decoupling from this idea that I have to always be earning my value and my worth. And so again, having my starting place be that I'm valuable and worthy in and of myself. And so, and it helps me set boundaries. So not answering emails on my days off, or honoring my humanity by utilizing my vacation days, right? Because I've earned those vacation days. I'm going to take them. So there's this IG account that I follow, Black Liturgies, and she's a Black woman. And she writes a lot of affirmations that I go to date. I'll drop it in the chat in a bit. And she has affirmations. And so even when I can't think of affirmations for myself, it's often helpful for me to go to that site to kind of get encouragement that I am more than enough, and that I don't have to work to prove myself. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. What about you?
My advice is to get clear about your values. So really diving into your why. What is truly important, what matters most to you. I really see our values as our compass for life and for living. And so this idea of being able to, at any moment, pull out of your pocket your compass of values and to look to that compass for direction in terms of making difficult decisions, or, just deciding how to show up in life, and really centering yourself on that, because our values are more grounded. Like when we talk about our thoughts and our emotions, those often are fleeting and they come and go. Whereas our values, I mean, sure, they may change and shift over time, but the general sense of them are stable. And when we can be clear about our values and being really, really clear. So like when you think about a compass, it has usually 4 directions on it. And so sometimes I do work with clients and they're like, oh, I just have all of these 30 values and that's what I live life by. And I'm like, well, how are you doing that with 30 of them? And so it can be helpful to parcel it down and really think about and really look at each part of your life. So your values as a mother may be different than your values as an employee or employer, and really specifying for each of these ways or roles that I show up in life as, here are my core values, and being like committed to living a life consistent with those values. And really, I see that as balance, because again, when we can lay down at the end of the day and say, I lived a values consistent day or life, it can really help us to let go of some of these other pressures that we're getting either from ourselves or from the outside world.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to ask the audience if in the chat, y'all would just share with us what has resonated with you today. What is just one takeaway or one thing you realize you need to chew on a little bit more, right? Is there something that you heard today, a thought that popped into your head that really stuck with you and you either want to move forward with that thought and or you just need to let something sink in with you? Go ahead and let us know in the chat. We really want to know where you're at. And as we do that, I also want to ask everyone to just take a moment to breathe with us. If you can go ahead and take a couple large, deep breaths and let it out. Nice and slow. Go ahead, breathe in. I always say when you're trying to center yourself after taking in a bunch of information, you want to breathe in all nice and dramatic. So pull in a whole bunch of air and then blow it out all loud so you could hear it out of your mouth. Go ahead and keep going. And then you want to actually allow your breath to slow down. You want to allow your eyes to fall. Go ahead and place your hand over your heart and focus until you can feel it beating. That right there, that is your life. That is your center, your purpose. I want to ask you to silently commit to protecting your heart fiercely. Go ahead and affirm to yourself that you can live a full, joyful life and be successful. Then I want you to visualize it. See yourself happy and successful. I want you to really see it. What are you doing? What are you wearing? How do you feel? See yourself laughing. What does your smile look like? Go ahead and continue your breath in and out, slowly, deeply. Then take a couple more dramatic, deep breaths in and out. Then go ahead and allow your attention to come back to the space. Allow yourself to raise your eyes. I want to thank you for sharing this time with us. We are looking forward to continuing these discussions and creating spaces where this is the norm, that we're constantly engaging in these discussions. In part one of the series, which was entitled The Blessings and the Burden of Strength, we shared our own stories about how we learned about strength and how we saw strength in women growing up. Then we dove into the historical context of how the strong Black woman came to be. We parsed out the good from the bad of that idea. And then we close with affirming a future where we are manifesting what strength could look like as we move beyond that. Today, in part two, moving beyond working twice as hard, we explored early messages we've received about working twice as hard. We discuss how to notice when we've taken that advice as far as it can take us. And we produce some strategies for how to radically shift our mindsets so we are able to live in the balance between our ambition, honoring the journey, and standing in our power. We will be wrapping up this series next month with part three. That session is entitled Maintaining Radical Joy as an Ambitious Black Woman. We will be going in to get specific about how do we do that in the midst of everything that is happening and continues to happen. What does radical joy actually look like? And we hope to see you there. If you loved today's session and want more from us before next month, there are several ways you can engage with us. We offer group wellness coaching for everyone who wants real strategies, community, and accountability for claiming and maintaining a life that has an abundance of love, money, and happiness. Those are our tenants at the Black Girl Doctor. We provide virtual therapy, and we send a weekly newsletter where we deliver workshops, wellness workshops in the workplace. So if you would like us to come speak in your workplace, you can find us and all of those resources on our website. We just dropped those in the chat. Also, I'll note that if any part of today's conversation was triggering for any reason and you are interested in talking with a therapist to work through anything, please utilize the therapist directory resources and or the crisis service resources that we are also dropping in the chat. Those will also be linked in the description of this recording when it goes up on YouTube in a couple of days. And we will ping you all via email once that is available so you can rewatch and or share it with a loved one. The directories that we're providing will help you find a licensed provider in your state. And the crisis resources are national. They're always free and available 24/7 for anyone that is interested. And with that, I will say, Dr. Dom, Dr. J, thank you both so much for today. I'd like to give you a final word if each of you would just share one final thought as we close that you'd like to leave us with.
Yes, this has been amazing, and you are more than enough.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'll just leave it and encourage people to fight to protect their energy and time.
Thank you so much. And as always, from the Black Girl Doctor, we are wishing you love, money, and happiness.
Yes. Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.